Good afternoon, and welcome to the University of Minnesota Center for Transportation Studies webinar, Accessibility in U.S. Cities. Where is transportation most sustainable? My name is James DeSoto, and I'm the Director of Program Development and Delivery here at the Center for Transportation Studies, or CTS. Today's webinar features a presentation from Eric Lind, Director of the CTS Accessibility Observatory, and the Observatory team. Before I introduce Eric, I wanted to share some additional information about the Accessibility Observatory here at CTS. The Accessibility Observatory at the University of Minnesota is the nation's leading resource for the research and application of accessibility-based transportation system evaluation. Its research and analysis services allow organizations such as state departments of transportation, transit agencies, and metropolitan planning organizations to analyze, evaluate, and plan transportation systems and land use in their areas. The observatory's work also allows organizations to benchmark themselves against other regions using the same methodology and data. The Accessibility Observatory is the only research unit of the Center for Transportation Studies and is dedicated to making transportation data available and usable for all of our partners. We are looking forward to audience participation and questions during Q&A time, which follows the presentation. We encourage you to use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen at any time to type questions or comments for our speakers. During Q&A, you can also use the raise hand feature if you prefer. We can then unmute you to share verbally. CTS staff member Sam Honduville is also on today's webinar, supporting the event and monitoring the Q&A. This event meets the continuing education requirements for 1 professional development hour credit and 1 American Institute of Certified Planners certification maintenance credit. The PDH form will be uploaded to the chat for anyone who needs it. Finally, I'd like to mention several upcoming events at the Center for Transportation Studies this autumn. CTS will be hosting our 2024 CTS Transportation Research Conference on November 7th. Other upcoming webinars include updating the Minnesota Stormwater Inspection and Maintenance Resource Guide on Thursday, October 31st, expanding the transportation workforce, Thursday, December 5th, unlocking autonomous transportation potential, key insights from the Go Marty shuttle pilot, Friday, December 6th. You can find more information about these events and our work at www.cts.umn.edu. Now, on to our webinar. Eric Lind and staff from the Accessibility Observatory will introduce the newest Access Across America report, Quantifying Access to Opportunity at a National Scale. The 2022 report reflects continued change in transportation in cities following the COVID-19 pandemic, as economic and travel behavior trends solidified. Highlights from the data on access to jobs by walking, biking, transit, and auto for the top 50 U.S. cities will be combined with a discussion of these urban adaptations and the contrast between auto access and more sustainable modes. Eric Lind is the director of the Accessibility Observatory at the University of Minnesota's Center for Transportation Studies. He leads research and implementation activities, including the National Accessibility Evaluation, to measure nationwide access to destinations across modes. Lind previously served as manager of research and analytics at Metro Transit, and his career has been focused on effective understanding of data for decision-making, most recently in transportation. He holds a PhD from the University of Maryland and is a member of the Transportation Research Board's Transit Data Committee. Eric?
Great. Thank you, James. Thank you, everyone, for being here today, for taking some time out of your day. Maybe you're eating lunch and coming to learn a little bit about accessibility and our recent measurements. Before I get into what we found, I want to emphasize the people that have done this work. So at the Accessibility Observatory, we're a small but mighty staff. Lead researcher Andrew Owen, who has been involved with this project for many years, you'll hear from. You'll also hear from Soumya Jain, a researcher. On the call is Shirley Liu, a researcher who can help out with some of our technical questions, and Matthew Hockert, who is a graduate research assistant in our group. We do work on access to destinations, as you'll hear a lot about today, within the Center for Transportation Studies. We work largely on grant-funded projects with partners from federal, state, local, regional, levels of government, as well as private industry. And really what we're focused on is trying to make these somewhat complicated data usable and understandable. And that's our mission today as well. So the outline for this afternoon's talk will go something like this. I'm going to mention a bit about what we mean by sustainability. And because that is one of the focuses we'll be bringing today. And then we'll get into why and how we measure access to destinations. The bulk of the talk today is about the National Accessibility Evaluation, so our Access Across America reports, and looking at what we found most recently in terms of travel by auto, transit, bike, and walk, as James just mentioned. And we'll close with some ways that you can explore our data, get your hands on our data and our reports, and answer some questions that might be raised as we go through these results today. So first, thinking about sustainability, the general concept of sustainability is, can it continue? Can growth continue? Can the trends we've seen continue as they are? Is there some reason why they might be limited? So part of a sustainability lens is thinking about limiting resources. What are the things that might hold back continued trend in growth? And just as a general principle, we're going to be looking at sustainability of the trends that we have documented over the last few years. In transportation in particular, sustainability connects to some very particular goals: reducing carbon emissions, reducing pollution, increasing people's health, increasing efficiency of the transportation system are all ways that people think about sustainability. And so we'll touch on some of these as we go forward, but I wanted to have that up front in terms of how we describe sustainability in transportation. So to motivate this look at accessibility and access to destinations, I want to have sort of a step back to how we could and do measure transportation, meaning how do we understand how well things are working? The network performance might be one way of looking at it. Usually when we measure transportation, think about performance, we think about things like speed. We think about delay and volume. So how fast can you travel? Are there things that seem to be slowing you down that could be removed? And how many people are able to take advantage of those speeds? Largely, this orientation is around vehicle movement, typically, automobiles and trucks, but of course, transit vehicles as well. But overall, the general framework is that fastest is best. So we're looking at segments, links, corridors, and we're asking ourselves, are we moving as fast as possible? And this framework can be sort of summed up as a mobility framework. In other words, we want things to be able to move. And what this aspect of transportation measurement misses is sort of the ends of the trip. Because the transportation network itself is not all about movement for movement's sake, but really is about connecting people to places they want to be, right? So we switch the orientation towards more of a people performance measurement. We can think about, can people get to the places they need or want to be? And those destinations can be reachable using speed, but there are other dimensions we can think about. For instance, slower might actually be safer. And closer might be better, even if speeds are low. And this is what raises the idea that rather than thinking about fastest being best, we can think about easiest is best. So how can I most easily reach the places that I need or want to be? And in fact, that ease is part of the definition of accessibility that we use that has been around for nearly 100 years in the transportation research literature, but is still not applied quite as often as we'd like in actual transportation planning and performance. But the definition is the ease with which a traveler could reach valued destinations. So there's a couple italicized phrases here I want to highlight. Ease, we've just been talking about. This refers to lowering a cost, right? So usually it could be amount of travel time, it could be actual monetary cost, it could be other elements around, safety, for instance, or simplicity. So if things are easy to reach, they're accessible. The second italicized phrase could is important as well because this emphasizes that what we are measuring with accessibility is potential. The opportunities that are out there that could be reached, but that doesn't mean that someone has reached them. Okay? And this dimension of accessibility, that it's about possibilities rather than what people actually do, is an important difference from other types of transportation measurement. So accessibility measures the potential for travel, not observed travel. Okay? There are lots of ways to measure observed travel, counting vehicles on roads, using lots of different, big data sources. You can take surveys as they do for transportation, regional planning. But what we're observing in the Accessibility Observatory is actually what's possible. So what opportunities are out there? And the reason this is very valuable for planning and performance is that it separates the concepts of supply and demand. Okay, so transportation agencies like a DOT or a transit, provider, they are offering up opportunities to make trips. That's the supply. The demand comes when people think about the destinations they want and need to get to and try to get to those places using those networks. Okay, so when we separate them, we can really evaluate them separately. The second really advantageous thing about accessibility is you can measure before you build. Okay, you can make a change to the particular roadway or transit service or bikeway, and then understand, okay, what opportunities will become available to people by using this math. So accessibility integrates land use and transportation because it combines where people are, how they're getting around, and what destinations are available. It's geographically specific, meaning we can map it really finely, which we'll get into. And it's comparable across modes, which is extremely valuable for thinking about how regional economies are operating when you think about people moving around. Okay. So accessibility is motivated by these aspects of observing what is possible, what people could reach, and how easy it is to reach it. I want to move into what we're actually talking about with accessibility and the data that are created. The first thing to understand is that accessibility includes options. So there's modal options, which type of vehicle or mode are you going to choose, walking, rolling, biking, and so on. And then within these, there are many different choices of pathways between origins and destinations. And essentially the math of the Accessibility Observatory is to calculate all of these options, all of these potential connections, and summarize them in useful ways. And so to give a little bit more detail about how this math actually works, I want to turn it over to Andrew Owen, the lead researcher at the Accessibility Observatory, who I mentioned has been involved with this math and this project for nearly a decade. So Andrew.
Thanks very much, Eric. So fundamentally, as Eric has described, access is about calculating what can be reached from different origins. And this involves combining transportation networks and the travel times that they provide with destinations and their locations out there in the world. The really challenging part, the computationally intensive part of that, is working on the travel times. So if we think of this from the smallest unit at which we run these calculations, we pick up an individual origin. The blue dot on this map is not too far from where those of us in Minnesota are sitting right now. And then we'll perform a routing calculation on the appropriate network, if we're talking about the road network, the bike network, pedestrian network, the transit network, to understand, well, how far can you get in maybe 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 15 minutes? Those of you who work in transportation planning are probably familiar with this concept as an isochrone, that area that can be reached in a particular given amount of time. So that tells us a data point, a reachable area for one location at one departure time. So then we need to start repeating this process because travel times vary over the course of the day for some modes. So we'll repeat this and calculate travel times during the morning peak period, during the noon period, during the PM peak period for auto to reflect the impact of congestion as travel times vary throughout the day. Multiple calculations are also really important for transit, where transit schedules change over the course of not just the day, but minute to minute. And then for bike, we'll actually repeat these calculations to represent different tolerances for stress levels of biking with traffic and different types of bike facilities. Given all those different kinds of travel calculations that we process, we always come back to that question: for each travel time, what can be reached? So we get that area, and then we add up what are the destinations inside of that area. That's all the process for just one individual origin. But there's lots of origins in the United States. So to apply this nationally, we attach all these calculations to the hierarchy of census geographies. We start way down at the block level, but we produce data that can be aggregated up till we're talking about metropolitan level or even state level statistics. What this looks like, going through block by block, we'll pick up each of those origins and calculate those isochrones, one for each origin point, again, repeated for different departure times, different stress levels, and those various mode combinations. That will give us individual data points block by block. At the most basic level, the key data point is we know a block, we know a departure time, and we know a travel time, a travel threshold, and how many jobs can be reached from that origin, departing at that time within that number of minutes. The example data point that we've pulled straight out of our database here is that from this block just south of downtown Los Angeles, leaving at approximately 8 a.m. by car and driving for 30 minutes, it's possible to reach about 2.5 million jobs with all those parameters. We've got that data point then repeated for all those modal combinations and departure times that I mentioned. That gives us a block level data set, which we can then aggregate back up through the census hierarchy to talk about, well, what's the average job access that's experienced by, or the typical job access that's experienced by a resident of this block group or the census tract, this county, or this state. That gives us a nationally comprehensive data set where we can talk about the number of jobs reachable by different modes at different times of day for any block in the US. Unfortunately, our jobs data set is limited by data availability. Alaska, Arkansas, and Mississippi don't currently participate in the census data program that lets us talk about jobs at such a fine-grained level. And so while we have access figures for those locations, for many blocks in Arkansas and Mississippi, the results are artificially zero because there's no jobs recorded for those locations. We can take that national data set. I should mention the context in which we're able to do this whole project, which is a pooled fund research project called the National Accessibility Evaluation. The pooled fund framework is run by FHWA, and it allows multiple state DOTs to get together and pool their resources towards a common research goal. So the states that are highlighted in green here are participating in the National Accessibility Evaluation Pooled Fund Study. And I want to particularly call out Minnesota DOT, MnDOT, who's been the lead agency and sort of the convener for all these states for almost 10 years now. We're grateful for their partnership. The data that we have covers the entire US, but these partners are key in helping us sort of guide the project, make decisions about methodology, what sorts of destinations to include, what kinds of metrics to produce, and we're really grateful for their participation. That national data set, we then turn into our Access Across America series of reports, which will look metropolitan area by metropolitan area around the country and provide some detailed maps of access like this. Here we're looking at access to jobs by driving. I talked through that example of a single block data point. Well, here we're seeing that same data point, jobs within 30 minutes by driving at 8 a.m., repeated over every block in the LA metro area. This is just for driving. So we do multiple reports for driving, but also for other modes, each one including not just those maps, but scorecards of access that summarize how many jobs can be reached over different time thresholds, how much is congestion impacting things, how do things look at different stress levels for bikes, a lot of different metrics for each mode. We then, because we've repeated this for every location and for every mode, we've got maps and scorecards that compare those metrics from place to place with consistent data scales and consistent methodology across all of those modes. So we can look at a map of access to jobs by driving and compare it directly to a map of access to jobs by biking or transit or by walking in the same location, calculated using the same methodology. That's a lot of data. There's a lot to explore. And one of the more interesting things to do is to look at metropolitan level summaries and start to look for patterns of like who's doing really well, who's doing not as well as we might want. And Eric next will take a look through some of those patterns that we've seen in our last update of Access Across America.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, it is tremendously fun to have so much data at our fingertips, and we work very hard to produce all this fine data. And part of what we're hoping to do today is to get you excited about it as well. So I am going to turn to looking within our most recent report across the country at the urban areas that we include, which are the top 50 U.S. urban areas by population. And one of the things that we're interested in is sort of a regional economic question, which is, are jobs available in proportion to how many there are, basically? So if you think about these top, let's see, 13 cities that are listed here and their total number of employment records in the census data that we use, you might think that someone in Chicago would have a little bit better access to jobs than someone in Dallas, and maybe a little worse than someone in LA, and so on. But actually, when we're thinking about getting to these jobs, not just having them be available in the region, but actually reaching them and how easy it is to reach them, that's where the question becomes a little bit more interesting. And what we want to know is, where is access to jobs higher than you might expect based on the regional total employment, or maybe lower? So here's a framework we're going to use to do that. And I'm going to bring up my little laser pointer so I can drive around here. This framework is going to compare the employment in a given region, so that chart of just the number of total jobs within a region. And cities are going to be ranked, 1 to 50 along this axis on the horizontal. And then we're going to look at our access data calculations and look at the weighted average access for someone in that region. So in other words, what is the typical resident experience in terms of job accessibility by auto or by transit in those cities? Okay? And that'll be aligned in order on the vertical axis. The one-to-one line is our kind of naive expectation, which says that if there's more jobs available in the region, there should be about that many available to the average resident, given that travel mode. Okay, but we are not going to see exactly correspondence along that one-to-one line. We're going to see some places where their access rank is higher than their employment rank, meaning for the number of jobs available in the region, it's actually easy to reach those jobs, given the mode. And likewise, if you see cities that are down here in the lower right-hand quadrant, it's more likely that even though they have a lot of jobs in the region, it's harder to reach some of those jobs. So harder, not easier, lower accessibility. Okay. So with that basic framework in mind, let me pop in the cities. So I'll give you a second to find your favorite place of interest as we go through this. In the meantime, I'm going to tell you that each dot is sized by the population, or essentially the worker population of that economic region. And they're arranged, as I said, in order: employment from left to right and access from top to bottom. Okay. So LA and New York, two of the biggest economic employment regions in the country, are also paired together quite nicely in the top right. But as you can see, there's a lot of spread, especially in the middle ranks of how cities are doing. If you take a city like Minneapolis, the way to read this chart might be to look at, okay, in employment rank, they're 14th. So it's the 14th biggest employment economy. But if you look at the amount of accessibility to jobs by driving, we're actually, and I see we because that's where we're speaking from, we're really 6th. in the country. Okay? So this indicates that Minneapolis has a higher than expected access to jobs given the size of our regional economy. There's some obvious outliers might be good to talk about. For instance, San Jose. So San Jose as a region is in the 30s for employment rank, but in the top 5 for driving accessibility. So what's going on there? Really what San Jose has available to it is not only its own regional job, but the entire regional economy of San Francisco. And a lot of that is available in 30 minutes drive. So people who live in this region can reach many jobs within San Jose, but also some in these neighboring regions as well. And we'll come back to San Jose later on in the talk. Okay, but to use another example, and not to pick on any regions, but I think Atlanta is well known as a place where there are a lot of jobs, but a lot of jobs that people have to drive to, and that driving is not particularly easy all the time in Atlanta. Okay, so Atlanta is in the top 10 for regional employment, but it's 22nd when it comes to driving accessibility to jobs. So this is the map of the Atlanta region, and it's highlighting the job access. But one of the other things that Andrew mentioned that we calculate is actually the impact of congestion on this access. So when we do our travel times, we can take travel times during the 8 a.m. peak, and we use observed data about how fast people are moving to calculate this axis. We can also look at what might be called free flow. So 2 a.m., examine the same travel times in the region. The difference between those travel times tells you the speed reduction that's happening due to traffic congestion. And we can actually map that. And so if you look at Atlanta, what you see is that congestion, in other words, the difference between AM peak travel time and free flow travel time, really limits the accessibility to jobs by people in Atlanta. There's this whole big smear of reduction from 100 to 200,000 jobs that are not available because of the number of cars that are on the road at that time. Okay, so when we see, especially in the auto impact, is that accessibility can be impacted by the number of people that are using the roads. And if we look back both pre and during the time of the COVID pandemic over the last few years, what we're able to see is how that dynamic played out over time. So we're going to move now from comparing places across the US to thinking about places over time. And that's one of the strong advantages of the Accessibility Observatory data set is we've been calculating these data the same way for the past almost 10 years. And so we can look at these patterns and how they changed. Okay. So each line here represents an urban area. We've gone back to 2017. And before the COVID era came along, things were relatively stable. There were changes year to year, but they weren't very large. Okay. Well, in 2021, our reporting that we released last year showed that, of course, during the COVID pandemic, lots of things changed. One of the things that changed is that congestion all but disappeared. And there was a tremendous spike in accessibility by auto due to that change. Okay? So nearly everywhere, there was a huge increase, 50% more jobs accessible at that time. Now, of course, one of the ironies of this when you're measuring opportunities is that there weren't very many people taking advantage of those opportunities. Suddenly, you could get anywhere in many regions within 20 minutes. However, many people didn't have the motivation to do that trip because their jobs weren't expecting them to be there or because things were actually being closed for public health reasons. Okay? What we're reporting this year is the snapback from that effect, which is that nearly everywhere in the most recent reporting, we saw how that large increase in access was not sustainable. And not sustainable in the sense of could not continue. Okay? Because people started to use it. So the access was available. People started to use it again to travel to their jobs, to make other types of trips. Even if they were working at home, they're making other types of trips. And the accessibility that was available became consumed. And this is a really fundamental dynamic that we see over and over with auto accessibility, is that when you have high accessibility, it will be used up with traffic. They will add more and more people using that accessibility, and then there will be a negative feedback because once traffic reaches a certain point, you're going to be limiting the accessibility of those places. So in Los Angeles, a very highly accessible place, the #1 place for you to reach a job with a car in the country, in fact, is also the #1 job or #1 place where congestion is limiting accessibility. Okay, so both are true. It's very high access, but that access gets used up and then limited over time. And so in this most recent report, we saw 25 to 30% of the jobs that were available in LA last year by car are no longer available to those residents in that amount of travel time. Okay. There is some variation in this across time. So LA, you see, as I mentioned, both had a huge reduction in this most recent year, but also remains the highest urban area for auto accessibility. So there's both parts of that story there. Places like Boston and Riverside were also among those that experienced the largest increase in congestion impacts this past year. In other words, the return of travel consuming the access that had been boosted during COVID. Some other places have fared a little differently. So San Jose, I mentioned, and Minneapolis seem to have plateaued at a little bit higher level of accessibility than they were at pre-COVID. And just, without going into a great deal of analysis about this, thinking about San Jose and Silicon Valley and the amount of telework available in that area, there may be a case where different behavior patterns in different urban areas, and certainly we can tell our own anecdotes about, large employers in downtown Minneapolis not requiring people to come back downtown on a regular basis. It could be that there are some places where this high accessibility is still better than it was pre-COVID. But one of the interesting things about these Access Across America reports is, of course, going in and looking at the areas you're interested in and finding what the trends are. Okay, so in summary, auto access boosted during COVID, but that wasn't a sustainable change because it's essentially consumed by people as soon as it's produced. What about more sustainable modes? So what about things like transit and walking and biking? Well, so to talk a little bit about transit, transit accessibility, access to jobs and other destinations really depends on transit schedules. Because the way that we plan trips in our calculations includes walking from home to the nearest or best stop or station, waiting for a transit vehicle, riding on that transit vehicle, and then walking or rolling to your final destination. Okay? So we use really precise schedules. Luckily, there has been great advances in the past few years in standardizing and sharing schedules in this format that originally was developed for sharing over, tools like Google Map or Apple Map. We're essentially using the same format to do our trip routing. So we look at over 900 published schedules across the country. We plan these trips every minute over 2 hours and look at the distribution of those travel times and essentially take the typical or median travel time to do our access calculations. So again, we can look at the top 50 US cities, arrange them as we did before, look at the difference between the regional economy size and the transit accessibility. Okay. So this graph looks very similar, maybe at the top, but you'll note that New York is far and away the #1 in both regional jobs and regional access. New York pairs an enormous economy with a really well-developed transit system that meets people where they live and brings them to where they want to go. Okay? And you can see as you look through the list of cities elsewhere, you might recognize a place like Portland as being well known for having maybe a higher level of transit accessibility than you might expect given the size of its region. You might be surprised to know that that's true of somewhere like Milwaukee as well. Okay? I want to look at San Francisco because San Francisco is outside the top 10 for regional, employment economy size, but is #2 in the country for transit accessibility, meaning people who use transit in San Francisco essentially have New York level job accessibility, right? Well, the map will tell you, and your knowledge of the region would also tell you that part of that is just how well matched where people live, where the transit system is, and where the jobs are, right? So that land use transportation connection is what makes San Francisco transit work so well, in addition to the fact that they are able to maintain frequent schedules and frequent high quality service. Okay? So connecting San Francisco and East Bay, Oakland, and Berkeley. The other thing is that this regional geography constrains where people and jobs and things can be, right? So having all of this water in the peninsulas makes for kind of an inherent efficiency when it comes to packing jobs and people together via transit. Some other places don't fare as well. We'll circle Dallas, which has a fairly robust transit system of bus and light rail. But when we look at how it fares compared to its place in the regional economy size, it's kind of underperforming when it comes to transit access. And if you look at the map of Dallas, you might be able to pick out, if you have knowledge of the region, where the light rail stations are. But there's not a widespread kind of blanket of access. It's really concentrated around particular high frequency lines. Okay? And if we compare that to the drive access in the Dallas region, you can see that it's really these maps are using the same exact colors for different levels of access. So it's really dwarfed by what you can reach by car. And if you zoom in and see that the square on the left is the same scale as the map on the right, you'll understand what the challenge for the region is when you're trying to compare what is available in terms of opportunity for people traveling by bus and rail versus traveling with the car. And this should help you understand why there are many different barriers to owning, licensing, insuring, fueling cars. The access given by that car, even considering congestion and things like that, is so much bigger than that with transit. Okay, so there's real lessons here for how cities are approaching the transportation that they're trying to provide people in terms of universal access to things. Transit is also facing some pretty particular challenges in the COVID era. Finances in terms of fare collection, federal support that's disappearing for operations. Ridership, I'm sure you've heard about that there's been, there was a crash during COVID and sort of hasn't quite recovered back in many places. The other challenge is workforce, and maybe less well understood, but many transit agencies have had to either reduce service or hold off on increasing service because they didn't have the number of drivers and mechanics and other workforce that are really necessary. All of these combine to lead to a tendency to reduce service. And what that means is that transit accessibility declines as well. And that's what we found when we look back across the last few years. In our data, New York is the blue line at the very top. All the rest of these are the top 50 US cities in different colors. What you see is, unlike auto, you didn't see a big spike in accessibility. In fact, I think it's a good thing that you saw mostly maintenance of accessibility during COVID, because as we know, that was the time when it was sort of essential travelers only on transit. And most areas still maintained a pretty healthy level of accessibility. But we have seen in the most recent year that that's starting to drop off. And 2022 was really a problem year for a lot of agencies with respect to hiring and workforce, especially. So places like Chicago and Washington and even Milwaukee showed marked declines in transit accessibility that are following both their reduction in service and especially high frequency service, but also in some respects, the concentration of jobs available. So the transit story is of slight decline. The sustainability angle here is really financial. Is there a financial sustainable path for agencies to maintain accessibility? Because we know access will inform ridership, and the amount of supply in terms of accessibility will help you recover that ridership. Okay, so touching briefly on then the most local access job accessibility methods that we use, biking and walking. For biking, we use, as Andrew mentioned, we incorporate infrastructure about separated bike paths, about different willingness to ride on different types of networks. That helps us understand the impact of those investments on the opportunities that are available to people. In terms of walking and rolling, we have not calculated until this year. We hadn't calculated a nationwide job accessibility by walking data set since 2015. And so we're really excited to have a new updated version of that to share with you all. And it's, it's interesting to think about walk accessibility to jobs. Obviously, that is not a popular mode. It's, less than 5% of people commute to their job by walking. But what it does tell you is about the number of opportunities that are available in a given neighborhood, a given block, in a given urban area. And one of the things we were interested in was not just what are the levels of walkability across these different places, but also who has access to them. Because many people do think of something like this picture on the right of Boston, of kind of an upscale shopping area. Maybe people that live in a wealthier, even gentrified neighborhood are the ones who enjoy walkable opportunities. So we wanted to look at this in terms of who has access to them. And in fact, we did find places where people who have lower wage jobs had higher job accessibility by walking. In other words, they lived in places where there were more opportunities available within a 30-minute walk than you saw in higher income areas. Okay? Baltimore being one example of that type of place. But obviously, this tells us a lot about the organization of the city, how income is distributed in different areas, and whether there's a strong match between the destinations that people want to reach and where they're living. The other thing to say about the walkability data that we're reporting is that it does not account in any way for the sort of micro barriers that exist that might get in the way of that ease of access. So we don't have information on sidewalk condition. We don't have information about lighting or safety. We are measuring travel time on the sidewalk networks that exist, but there are a lot of other dimensions to this walk access that are worth exploring. Okay, so this is a really lightning tour through access across America. These modal reports are well worth digging into. Again, you've got charts and maps and data for every of these top 50 cities. My summary is that, in the auto mode, we saw increases in access that were unsustainable because as access increases and more people use it, access declines. It's that negative feedback loop that results from consumption of that access. That doesn't happen with transit. The more people that use transit access, it's actually more likely to improve because of changes from the transit agency in response. So transit agencies are really facing more of a financial unsustainability problem, and making sure that they can piece together the funding from fares, from state and local funding, from federal funding where available, to solve those workplace challenges and keep the level of service where it needs to be to grow ridership. And then finally, looking at sustainable local access, this really is about the coordination between land use in terms of destinations and residences. And we are just really getting into this idea of asking who has access. And this is really where we can use accessibility data to answer questions about equity that are really important for a lot of different agencies at all levels of government at this point. So that was a lot. I know that was a lot. I'm going to now invite you to witness how you can explore these data yourself and understand a little bit more about these conclusions yourself. We have with us researcher Soumya Jain, who is going to walk us through an app that she's authored that makes it a little bit easier to maybe understand and visualize these data. So I will turn it over to you, Soumya.
Thanks, Eric. Just a thumbs up, Eric, if you can see my screen. Perfect. In a little bit, you'll be able to access the link to this app. And when you click on it, this is the page you'll be taken to. So, like Eric said, what this interactive app basically does is we're looking at the same data that we've been talking about on this webinar. It just allows you to take a subset of that data and view it for yourself, interact with the data, see what it looks like. There's a lot more where this is coming from, but this is just a subset that you have the option of interacting with if you want. So once you click on the link, it will take you to this page, the app page. And how we've set up this app for you is the moment it opens with the information widget. With this information widget, what it tells you is exactly what you're looking at. So it talks about we're looking at the data that comes out of the National Accessibility Evaluation Study for the 2022 cycle. What we're looking at here are census tracts for the entirety of the US. And what it is telling us, or what it will tell us, is how many jobs on average can someone living in a census tract can access within a travel time of 30 minutes by driving, transit, biking, or walking. Now, like Eric and Andrew both said, we calculate these at a fine scale of the census block and have the flexibility of averaging it to any geography we want. And right now we're looking at census tracts. This information widget will also tell you how to navigate through the app. There's a layers widget where I'll show you how you can switch layers on and off, look at different modes, do modal comparisons. It also talks about how you can contact us, where the data is missing. Let's look at some of the layers. So right here, if I click on the layers app, and I'm going to set this up so that it's easier to understand. We also have legend right here. So all the colors that you see from the Layers app, we know that what we're looking at is auto access to jobs within a travel time of 30 minutes. And on the right with the legend, you can see as you see colors that are closer to orange, red, it's higher access to jobs within that particular travel time. Now, because we're in Minneapolis, let's zoom in to, let's say, the Midwest. What you're seeing here are all the urban centers being highlighted, because again, this goes back to our inputs, which is the network data, the jobs data. Wherever you're seeing higher intense red and purple, it just means there's more jobs accessible by driving within a travel time of 30 minutes. In other words, there's either a very robust network or a lot of jobs, or a combination of the two where you're seeing high access. Now, because we have 4 different modes, let's switch from auto to, say, transit. Eric has already pointed this out from the different maps that we were looking at. How in the US we experience auto access is very different from how we experience transit access. The network is the same, but it highly depends on where you see high frequency transit connections. Let's zoom into Minneapolis. Here, what we're seeing are the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. You can see what access looks like within a travel time of 30 minutes. Now, for transit, we use walking as an egress mode. So you can see that between Minneapolis and St. Paul, there is light rail, there's a bus network connecting both cities as well as the jobs around here. And you can see certain tracks being highlighted, or you can almost see certain transit lines being highlighted. Wherever you see higher access compared to, other areas, you can assume these are high frequency station areas showing access. Now, Minneapolis and St. Paul were known to have a robust bike network as well. So if I switch from transit to bike, you can see access is almost better compared to when we're looking at just transit. Let me switch this to walk. And you see how it just diminishes a little. It's more closer to where you probably see a high density of jobs that you can walk to these jobs. Now you might ask how like switching the layers on and off is great, but how do I compare between different modes? So you have the option here within this app to zoom in and click on each of the tracks. What that will do for you is tell you the details about this tract, the geoid, what state it's in, what county it's part of. We also have in there population from 2022 ACS 5-year estimates. It tells you about what year of AO data you're looking at. And getting to the point, what it also tells you is from this particular tract, you can access around 1.6 million jobs by driving, 250,000 by transit, 300,000 by biking, and 130,000 by walking. Now, I do want to compare this with, let's say, so this tract right here is within the downtown area of Minneapolis that has a good high frequency transit system. I want to take your attention back to the fact that we use walking as an egress mode. So when you're seeing transit here, this is a combination of this walking access as well as the high frequency transit. Let's go to a suburb of Minneapolis, Minnetonka. We don't really have a very high frequency transit or a well-connected transit system connecting Minnetonka residents to jobs in Minneapolis and St. Paul. So here you can see transit access is the exact same as walking access. So just highlighting how we calculate these, what you see, what data you're seeing at here. Now, Shirley might have already shared the link to this app. Again, treat it as something where you're just looking at a subset of the data that comes out of the NAE study. Try interacting with it. Let us know if you have questions. Within the information widget, if you scroll down, you have the option of reaching out to us through our website. Let us know if you have questions. And yeah, reach out to us. Eric, I'm going to hand it back to you for questions.
Thank you, Samia. That is awesome. I know people are going to be excited about exploring that. Before we get to questions, and I see that there's a very active chat, and thank you, Shirley and Andrew, for answering questions as we go. These reports and data that we're talking about, again, are easily available through our website. We have a QR code there. There's also, if you go to cts.umn.edu, you'll be able to find Accessibility Observatory or access.umn.edu, which I'll show in a second. But we are not limiting in terms of how we want people to use these data. So we're trying to provide them in many different forms in these written reports in the interactive web app that Samia just showed, but also in downloadable, CSV files that have different travel times and different dimensions of access as well. So if you have a use case for this, whether it be agency application or research, please just let us know. It would be great to have you use our data or connect with us around how you think about using it. So with that, I'm going to say we should take questions if any remain. We have about 5 minutes left, it looks like, James. So maybe I'll let you see if there are any that need answering out loud.
Excellent. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Andrew, Samia, and the rest of the team that have been answering chats as well. We'll now move on to your questions for Eric and the rest of the team. We have 2 that are live right now in our Q&A section. So let's start with the most recent. This is from Beth. Will future iterations take fueling type into account? For example, if driving in EV?
That's a great question. So right now, we do not take fueling type into account in terms of travel times. Most of our data is really about daily travel. So that might come more into play in thinking about long distance travel with EV, that might be a limiting factor on driving time. But in general, we would treat electric cars as being the same as gasoline cars. One place we're just starting to dabble is actually in electric bikes. And those do make a big difference in terms of travel time and in some cases comfort level of using different parts of the network. So I think there is a lot of development we can do in terms of access via e-bike that might look a lot different than access versus the way that we've been calculating it so far.
Excellent. Thank you, Eric. We have a question here from Ross. Looking at the difference between Minneapolis and St. Paul, can you talk more about the impact on this data with a consideration of job density and residential density?
That's a great question. So one of the things I just want to emphasize, and we didn't really dwell on all the details of the methods, but when we're reporting these averages, we're weighting them by the residents in the given area that are experiencing them. So it's really meant to represent what a typical person in that particular geography would experience. So in that way, it sort of accounts for the distribution of population within the given region. Obviously, job density and residential density, all things being equal, will increase access. One of the really interesting things about accessibility is it allows you to think about, let's say the job distribution on the landscape stayed the same. You can increase accessibility by moving people quicker. That's often the answer that transportation agencies think about. You can also increase accessibility by putting more people in the places that already have high access. So increasing residential density in places of high access, think about, maybe a density transit-oriented development. That sort of approach can actually increase overall accessibility without changing the transportation network, just by taking advantage of the places where access is already high. So they're very related, and obviously there's a reciprocal relationship that's kind of tough to untangle sometimes.
Excellent. Thank you, Eric. So one of the things that was answered in the Q&A already, but I think it's probably pertinent to quickly cover again. What about destinations beyond jobs, like grocery stores, parks, healthcare, some of those other destinations people care about?
Absolutely, yeah. That is something that this group has begun to tackle, and in the last 2 years of this National Accessibility Evaluation, we have been calculating travel times and access to just those types of destinations, particularly schools, groceries, healthcare, things like childcare. We're beginning to expand that list and, really make some use of it. I mean, a project that Shirley has been working on is trying to quantify where in the US you might find something like a 15-minute city, for instance, where you could reach a lot of different destination types within an easy walk or bike, right? And as we expand our destination set, we're able to kind of do those types of studies even more easily. But that question is right on. That's something we're currently working on. It's not currently incorporated into these Access Across America reports, which, as you might have seen, are sort of oriented towards that long-term perspective of kind of measuring things the same way over time.
Excellent. Thank you. Maybe one last question. I know we're at time here, but it just came across. Is there consideration in the future to job types instead of just job access?
There is, and actually these data, we're summarizing total jobs as total opportunities, but the census data has industry categories, wage levels, other demographics about the workers who are in those jobs. So actually we do have the data to break it out in a lot of different ways, different job types, retail versus manufacturing versus, office work, things like that.
Excellent. Well, once again, thank you, Eric. Thank you for all the work that the Accessibility Observatory and the team has done. Thanks again to all of the people who attended today. And I want to also say that this will be eventually posted at the CTS website so that people can see this valuable information again in the future. So again, thanks to our presenters, thanks to those who attended, and we hope everyone has a pleasant rest of your day.